Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line. The Russians have made a significant advance within Dvorichna, gaining almost full control over the town on the western bank of the Uska river line. The Russians also advanced further along the Serbets river line east of Bova. The Russians have also managed to advance north of Kursk and within VonoSilka itself. The Russians have also managed to advance within the Kursk region. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Russians have managed to capture the southern outskirts of the town of Nikolsky. With this, the Russians are now moving in towards the Luknia river line, cutting off the western supply route for the Ukrainian forces along the village agglomeration along the Luknia river line. With this, there's only a single supply line left. That is the one to the east of Nikolsky. If the Russians manage to gain control over Nikolsky, they'll be able to cut off that final supply line, and the Ukrainian forces in this entire area would be operationally encircled, with some off-road locations where the Ukrainians can supply from, which would be under heavy fire from Russian artillery and FPV drones. The Ukrainian forces along the villages here along the Luknia river line are all located within the towns, as well as the forest lines to the east. The forest lines to the east are very wide and are well connected. This allows for an extensive Ukrainian network of forces located within those areas. This allows for a wide front on the eastern section of the front line. However, with the Russian captures in the western part of the river line, the entire section is along the front line and is therefore under heavy pressure by the Russian forces. With the Russian control over the fortified positions east of Leonidova and Alexandria, they've secured the western flank, and with their control along the anti-tank ditches and the dragon teeth, the Russians can use that as a front line to launch operations and focus their forces along the river line. This is to push the Ukrainians out of the towns and into the forest lines and into the railways, which will expose them further where they will have little cover and instead be exposed in the forest lines and in the fields to the east. The Russians' objective here will be to push the Ukrainians out of the river line and onto the railway and onto the forest lines to expose them and make them vulnerable prior to launching operations down along the road towards Svetlykovo and there on Sucha. The Russians continue their offensive operations in the Kursk region, while the Ukrainians also managed to recapture some parts and gain control over new areas here in the Kursk region. The Russians have managed to advance within Dvorichna, gaining control over the western parts of it, leaving only the northwestern parts, the Dvorichna district, remaining under Ukrainian control, while the Russians have now captured both Debacle, Kirpishne, Sahunivka, and Rakova here in the Dvorichna area. It seems inevitable that the Russians will gain control over remaining parts of Dvorichna very soon, within the next few days, and this will lead to the Russians having a strong foothold across the Uska river line that they can use as a supply hub for further offensive operations. This will likely lead to Russian offensive operations in the northern, northwestern, and southwestern directions to expand their foothold, expand it on a wider area along the river line to have multiple crossings across the river line, and also deeper into the Ukrainian territory to have a buffer zone around this bridgehead across the river line to allow the Russian forces to concentrate their forces and reduce the reconnaissance abilities of the Ukrainians in the area to then launch further offensive operations in the area. Taking a closer look at the area, we see that around Dvorichna there's only Zapatne. Other than that, there's practically no settlements. There's a bunch of forest patches which will allow the Russians to send infantry into these areas with the cover of the trees. And then there's the highway that connects directly from Dvorichna to Kupiansk. The Russians will likely take a roundabout way towards Kupiansk from Dvorichna rather than advancing along the highway directly. They'll likely advance along the river line instead to gain control over the settlements along the river line, also allowing for further crossings across closer towards Kupiansk, at the same time to gain control over the southern parts of the highway without moving into the western parts. The objective would be to gain control over the river line first before moving along the highway towards Kupiansk. The objective here would be to secure the foothold across and not take any big risks, and instead take a safer approach and Once they have gained control over a wider area of the Uska River line, they can start advancing further westwards while expanding their foothold and their buffer zone between them positions along the river line and the Ukrainian positions to then launch operations into Kupiansk itself. If they gain control over the eastern and western parts of Kupiansk, they'll be able to have a proper crossing between that and Dvorichna, and it will allow the Russians to launch larger operations across the Uska River line, especially if they combine it with some cross-border operations near Belgorod. In the direction of Bova, the Russians have managed to advance and gain control over Nadia. They have also managed to gain control over parts of Dvorichna. The Russians are here expanding their foothold across the Serebets river line, which runs through the western parts of Setove, which is the main supply hub for the Russian forces in the area. With this, the Russians are looking to gain a stronger presence here along the direction of Bova. They are looking to siege the town itself, which is another supply hub of the Ukrainian forces on the eastern bank of the Uska River line. We see that the Ukrainians have two lines of defense around Bova, where they are securing the town itself. We see that the Russian operations here in the eastern parts is looking to gain control over the eastern parts of the Stepi and Kupianki direction, where the objective of the Russians is to launch operations along the road, gain control of it, and then push towards the Ukrainian positions southeast of Bova, and generally expand their control east of the fortified positions, widening the area of the front line that is aligned with the fortified positions. This will allow the Russians to spread out the Ukrainian forces as much as possible, and then if they concentrate their forces in one direction, they'll be able to break through the defensive line and then move alongside it along the weaker points of the Ukrainian defensive positions to gain full control of it, and then move on to the next one. Therefore, the Russians are looking to gain full control over the towns along the road here, and this will require further pressure along the Serebets river line, expanding their foothold across the river line, and then gaining control of this area before they start moving towards Bova itself. There will also likely be further offensive operations along the Uska River line to gain control over Bohuslavka before they reach the fortified line itself. Further south, the Russians have managed to advance in the northern flank of Kursk, where they've gained control over one of the first lines in the area west of Slovianka. The Russians are slowly moving towards the main highway towards Andreevka, and the Ukrainians have a lot of forces in the area, in the fortified positions and in the general area, to slow down the Russians as much as possible. But with control over Yasenova along the river line here near Ukrainka, and with control over Slovianka and Petropavlivka, it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain control of the highway and start sieging Andreevka from the rear. At the same time, the Russians have also advanced south of Kursk in the direction of Konstantinopel, where they are pushing towards the town itself. We see here the Russians are pushing both towards Andreevka and Konstantinopel at the same time, while also fighting over Dashne, and with the pushes along the Zokhyali river line also towards Olekli. If they cross over the river line to the north, the Vovcha river line, the Russians can flank Olekli from multiple directions and fight over the fortified positions in between Dashne and Olekli. Therefore, we see that there is a combined efforts by the Russian forces here west of Kursk to gain control over Dashne, Olekli, Konstantinopel, and Andreevka from multiple directions. In a similar manner, we see here in the direction of VonoSilka, the Russians have entered the eastern outskirts of VonoSilka, expanding their foothold. This, together with their push along the river line to the west, means that they're looking to pincer the Ukrainian forces, cutting off the southern parts of VonoSilka along the river line to completely encircle that force before they move on to the northern outskirts of the town. The Russians are conducting multiple operations across the front line to encircle Ukrainian forces, gain control over towns and fortified positions, improving their own position, gaining control over supply hubs, and threatening the Ukrainian positions both in the Kursk region, in the eastern section of the front line, near Kursk, Pokrovsk, and VonoSilka, as well as within the outskirts of Toretsk and Joseph Yar. The Russian offensive has now been launched continuously for 14 months, and this is nowhere near the end of it. The pressure simply increases as time passes by, and as if the situation couldn't get more difficult for Ukraine, with Donald Trump's inauguration yesterday, the 20th of January, the first day in office, he's already signed a lot of executive orders, one of which is pausing all foreign aid two different countries until they align with US interest. And based on that, the Ukraine will have all of their military aid and economic aid from the United States paused until Trump decides that it is fine. Therefore, already on day one of office for Donald Trump, he's already stopped all US aid to Ukraine. This means that if this continues and he doesn't restart the aid or increase the aid, then the impact this will have on Ukraine will be devastating in terms of their defensive capabilities, and the Russians will significantly increase the speed at which they're capturing territory. Trump has already edited his opinion from peace in Ukraine on his first day of office to within the first 6 months, potentially, hopefully. He hopes that it will be possible within 6 months. And based on that, it is clear that the situation is much more complex than he initially thought, and the situation will likely continue. However, it will grow more and more difficult for Ukraine. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.